Good morning and happy Sabbath, church. Thanks for joining us online here this morning. As you can see, we're still on Zoom, we're still on YouTube, we still have our pre-recorded messages. We have decided to postpone our reopening date. We will come back, I promise. We will come back, but it won't be just yet. It won't be just yet. It's going to be here soon, but we still need to work some little things out just to ensure that everyone is safe. In the meantime, we will continue to have information for you on our website. That is the place where you can get the most up-to-date information about where we are and what decisions have been made. Along with our website, you see, once again, our options for donating to our ministry, whether through offering or tithe. You have two options, one through the Adventist Giving link if you prefer an online format, or you can mail a check in through the P.O. box. Our treasurer is checking that weekly for any monies that might come in. Again, week by week, I just want to say thank you for all that you donate, for your stewardship in supporting this ministry. We can't do it without you, and part of us joining together is in this aspect. And so I thank you for all that you've done and all that you continue to give to our ministry. We continue with our series on Job this week. Next week we conclude with God's final speech, but this week we're going to consider his first speech to Job and the direction that God takes. It's not really what one expects from the story so far. I hope and pray it's a blessing for you. May you have a happy Sabbath and be well. We are reaching the end of Job's story. All along we've been coming to this point, we've been anticipating this point where God finally speaks. But before we get to God speak, to his divine speech, we're going to recap really quickly where we have been so far. What has Job declared and what has Job wanted? Job has repeated his demand many times, but perhaps the verse that kind of summarizes it the best is Job 31:35, where he says, "If only someone would listen to me. Look, I will sign my name to my defense. Let the Almighty answer me. Let my accuser write out the charges against me." While his three friends argued that the solution to Job's suffering was found in his repentance, that he turned from his evil ways. Whatever the merits of his friends' arguments, whatever they might be, they come across as religious ideologues. They are caricatures of people who are more concerned about being right in their ways than having compassion towards those who challenge their truth. Job, on the other hand, on the other side, believed that the answer would come from meeting with God. He felt that God was treating him unjustly and that a meeting with God would be the answer to his ailments. If he only had a moment before God to declare his innocence, if God had listened to him, if he had a moment before God, then things would be settled for him. See, for Job, the answers that he yearns for, they all reside in a God that he cannot quite find. The wisdom that he needs to understand why this God is silent is still yet beyond his grasp. He says, "Let the Almighty answer me." His words are bold and they're desperate. They're a challenge for God to come out of hiding. If God does not respond, then Job will be forced to conclude that the answer that he seeks, though that thing that he needs, the God that he's relentlessly pursued, is nowhere to be found. His answers are nowhere to be found. But at the end of the day, that faith, religion, is after all just a nightlight for children. Job has moved from blessing God to cursing the day that he was born, and now to the edge of indignant rebellion. Granted, at first, Job, he felt that God was just too powerful to challenge. He realized his place and he thought God is too transcendent to even care, perhaps. He longed at times for a mediating presence between him and God. But as time went on in the book, as the story progressed, Job grew in confidence that his cause was right and just, and that he would eventually win his day in court against God who persecuted him. Perhaps, like Ivan from the Brothers Karamazov last week, Job believed that he had the moral superiority and that moral righteousness was on his side. In Job 38, Job finally gets what he desires. The passages for today, Job finally gets what he's desired, an audience with God. However, it does not go as he had perhaps anticipated. We, as readers of this text, have been anticipating this moment where God finally speaks. Those of us who are familiar with the story know that God will come out and speak. And so we've been waiting for this moment in the story. We've sat with Job's suffering. We've sat with Job's questions. Last week we ended on a sad and not so hopeful place. But this week is finally the week where God speaks to Job. But we must be careful at this point to expect God speaking to be the solution, the conclusion to this story, to be the answer to Job's questions. And we should be cautious at this point to prejudge what God's answer might mean. Because Job has brought profound questions before God, questions about God's relationship with him and about God's commitment to justice and a moral order in the universe. We began this series when it was a time in our country's history where this question continued to resonate to the surface. What is our commitment to justice? And Job, in a similar way, is demanding from God his commitment to justice, declaring that God, you created a moral order, and so why haven't you lived up to it? But what he seeks from God is not so much an explanation as a justification for what he perceives to be God's treatment of him. The question really is God credible? Is God willing to do what is right? And so we begin chapter 38 with a theophany, an encounter with God, God's appearance before Job in a whirlwind or a tempest fills the scene with a display of overwhelming force for Job. God responds by taking Job along this virtual journey through the world and through God's creation. The whirlwind, what a fitting picture, what a fitting scene for what God is about to do, how God is about to overwhelm Job. We see in chapter 38, verse 1, then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, the tempest. Here, right off the bat, we see a very important designation, a very important detail, a characteristic of God that we haven't seen since chapter 2. The author of Job makes it a point to insert this important detail. He says, the Lord came in from the whirlwind. The author uses the designation of Lord, Yahweh. It's the divine name that we haven't seen since, again, the first couple chapters of the book of Job. It's the very divine name that has given another theophany at another point in history to Moses, the revelation of the divine name to Moses at the burning bush. It's that very name that the poet connects the appearance of God to Job with the faith tradition of Israel. He's making that bridge with that divine name. It is within that divine name that the covenant between God and God's people is placed and grounded. It's in that very name that shaped the identity of Israel and the identity of all of God's people. It's in that very name, it's in this very story, it's in the personhood of Job that the voice of each person crying out in anguish of personal existence, asking the question, why? But it is also, at the same time, God's voice answering not the why question, but answering with the person question. I am who I am. God's first response to Job is not what we might expect. It's not a declaration. It's not an explanation that addresses Job's indictments and his complaints against God. Instead, God confronts Job, or rather overwhelms Job, with a barrage of challenging questions that cascade one poetic image over another, as if the point is to kind of take our breath away. One thing I failed to mention at the beginning of this series is the rhetoric used along the way. I failed to mention that the first couple chapters of Job, where it's setting the scene of the story, it's written in a prose sort of rhetoric. And after that, once the scene is set, starting in chapter 3, up until the final chapter, we see poetry. The language shifts, the rhetoric shifts into a form of poetry. And God's speech, the divine speech towards Job, is one of poetic nature. There's a shift to poetry in the story. And here in chapter 38, the poetry is quite breathtaking. Let's turn your Bibles to chapter 38, and I will read segments of the story with you. Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, "Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have questions for you, and you must answer them. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations, and who laid its cornerstone? As the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Who kept the sea inside its boundaries as it burst from the womb, as it clothed it with clouds and wrapped it in thick darkness? For I locked it behind barred gates, limiting its shores. I said, this far and no farther will you come. Here your proud waves must stop. Have you ever commanded the morning to appear and caused the dawn to rise in the east? Have you made daylight spread to the ends of the earth to bring an end to the night's wickedness? As the light approaches, the earth takes shape like clay pressed beneath a seal. It is robed in brilliant colors. The light disturbs the wicked and stops the arm that is raised in violence. Have you explored the springs from which the seas come? Have you explored their depths? Do you know where the gates of death are located? Have you seen the gates of utter gloom? Do you realize the extent of the earth? Tell me about it if you know. Then the Lord said to Job, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You are God's critic, but do you have the answers? What might strike the reader as strange in God's response is that Job here has never really questioned God's power in creation. God, the Lord, Yahweh, he goes on this tirade about creation, asking Job these rhetorical questions as if Job could know the answer. But of course, Job has no way of knowing the questions, the answers to the questions that are being asked. Some might accuse God of this at this point of kind of avoiding the questions here, of beating around the bush, of doing that one political move where you don't really answer the question that's being asked for you. But perhaps God is doing something different here. Perhaps the forceful questions that God poses to Job here are intended to motivate a bit of trust in Job. If that's the case, it's going to be a hard project for God because given everything that Job has said, it will require a radical shift in Job's perception. Since from his point of view, God seems bent on destroying his creation rather than preserving his creation. If this is the case, then the probing that God has or makes towards Job is for a creative purpose. The aim is not the destruction as Job might think. It's not humiliation for Job, as some interpreters might think, but perhaps God's plan here, God's intention here, is for Job's transformation. God's indictment of Job is not that he's guilty of sin, but rather that he's ignorant. With fear and trembling, Job summoned God as the judge. But what appeared before Job, the God that appeared before Job, is the wisdom teacher who comes before him. A teacher ready to take Job in and lead him to a path of transformation. They are, after all, rhetorical questions, the device of teachers that show Job a stunning description of God's careful design of the universe. Here we see a very different account of God's creation versus the creation account in Genesis, where in Genesis God speaks and the earth just comes into existence. Here the account of God's creation is detailed, it's precise, it's like an architect or an engineer designing something. And at the end of this account, God asks his challenger, God asks Job, what do you have to say, Job? Can Job add anything or correct anything? What has he now to tell God? God's tone is corrective, but it's not mocking at this point. God's rhetoric does not intend to humiliate Job, but to force him to examine his own perceptions of reality, and in the process, forces Job to reconsider his place in all of this. We see the beginning of Job's transformation here in his first response to God. His words are of humility, an admission of awe, and an expression of wonder. He says to the effect, I am of little worth. Job responds to the Lord, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. I have said too much already. I have nothing more to say. It's interesting to note here that before this moment, Job had vowed to approach God as a prince, to give God a full accounting of his life. But here we don't see a pompous prince here. Job has heard what God has to say, and he realizes, who is he to say anything in return? In the presence of God, Job begins to see himself as well as God. He has said everything he has wanted to say. He has made his case repeatedly over and over and has nothing more to add. Now he realizes that he is prepared to listen respectfully. But we must realize that the change, the transformation, Job, is not a result because of a threat or a condemnation on God's part. But rather it's born from a glimpse of God's complex design of the world that Job thought he knew. Job's case against God assumes not that the system is wrong or the principle is misunderstood, but that God has failed to govern the created world justly. This is Job's claim against God. But in turn, God's lesson for Job, the way that he teaches Job, is to describe a world that is much more complex than perhaps Job knows and understands. That this world is more about both and than either or. A world with a place for contradictions and ambiguities, with times and places for everything under the heavens, to borrow a phrase from Ecclesiastes. In summary, Job at this point is struck by the sublime. The sublime is classically described in terms of a crisis of understanding. Crucial to the sublime is the perceiving subject's sense of being overwhelmed by something too immense, vast, or powerful to be grasped by the categories available to the mind. More than merely a cognitive crisis, it is a crisis of subjectivity itself. And yet what is in some respects a negative experience is paradoxically accompanied by a sense of transport or elation, or a moment in which the self is realized in a new way. Not surprisingly, the divine speeches in Job have often served as parade examples of the sublime. The reason why it is worth mentioning that the author of Job presents God's words, God's divine speech towards Job in poetic form, is because its poetry takes on the shape of an evocative form of rhetoric. Poetry is evocative. The rhetoric of poetry leaves blanks to be filled in by the reader. It is indirect and suggestive, inviting readers to imagine how general principles may be converted in specific truths that can be accessed in concrete circumstances. Prose, in contrast to poetry, reduces the mystery of suffering at this point. It reduces it to settled truths, and it can be stated in simple, unquestionable affirmations. This is why prose is unacceptable in this position. Take, for example, the Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. A text taken from the beginning of Job's story where the author is writing in prose. Again, one of these proverbs that has been repeated in Job's life. One of these proverbs that his friends surely repeated to Job without really thinking twice. Proverbs that are way too easy to just abstract and place in any sort of situation. The power of the story lies in God's speech of poetry. Job's transformation here, the goal of this story, that Job's transformation is possible because of his relentless pursuit of God and being open to the sublime nature of God. This moment where you're open to the complexity of God's character, of God's nature, where we're opening ourselves to God's movement, and we realize that we can't quite pin down God into this box. It's at this moment that Job's response is to listen carefully, to listen respectfully, to learn the ways of God. And it's only faith that can take him there. It's for these two reasons. His transformation is possible for these two reasons: his relentless pursuit of God and his openness to the sublime nature of God. There's this essay on the theological significance of biblical poetry, and I want to read a section of it for you this morning. It says, "Poetic discourse is thus a mode of speech that is indirect, open, and rooted in imagination. All of this is true about the poetic speech from God. It too is indirect, open, universal, and dependent upon the imagination for construction. It is interesting in this regard to compare the prose speech of God in the book of Job with the poetic divine speech. The prose speech at the very beginning and the divine speech at the very end. Not to dismiss the former, it has its very important function, but we are clearly drawn to the open, figurative, indirect speech of God, filled with ambiguity, and we are puzzled by the explicit, literal, resolving divine speech of the epilogue. If one thinks that simply a matter of content, then one has not heard the poetry. Or perhaps one should say that what is happening belongs in one case to imaginative, open, poetic speech, and in the other to explanatory, bound prose speech." In a recent scientific work titled Theories of Everything, John Barrows, a cosmologist, by the way, makes the statement at the end of the book that no non-poetic view of reality can be complete. The point that I'm getting at this morning, what I'm trying to drive home for you, the example that I want us to draw from Job this morning, and from the speeches of God to Job, is that there's a level of openness to God's mystery that we need to be comfortable with adopting. That in our everyday lives, in the way that we move in the world, in the ways that we like to form religious traditions, we like and are comfortable with prose because it's matter of fact. They're statements of fact. They attempt to be statements that can be universal. But here the author of Job notices something important, that there's something important in poetry, in biblical poetry at this time, where the prose of Job's friends didn't match Job's experience. Job decided to go directly to the source in his relentless pursuit of God. My hope is that we seek this transformation that is only possible by these two things in Job's story. That this relentless pursuit of God, this faith that we've adopted as our own, this faith given to us by God, and this faith that we continue to grow and nourish, becomes a faith that drives us into this relentless pursuit of God, but also makes us aware of the sublime nature of God. That this moment, that the sublime nature of God creates this cognitive dissonance at times, where we can't quite make sense of our experience. That all of the traditions that we've created are great in guiding us to a place, but they can't ever get us to that place that we're trying to go. They serve as guides for our direction forward, but it's only this moment of awe, of wonder, of imagination, of creativity, of moving into that space where faith takes hold, it takes root into our very lives. And this isn't easy for all of us. For some of us, we like facts. We're drawn to prose. We want statements that we can hold on to forever. But it's interesting that in the book of Job here, where Job is seeking answers, where he's seeking statements that he can draw from, where he wants solid explanations from God, all God gives him in this first speech is, I am who I am. And it's with that discomfort, it's with that shortness, it's with that insufficient answer that's all that Job gets, that he realizes that there's something more here, there's something more, there's something greater than what he and his friends have understood of God. And it's these two things, his relentless pursuit and his openness to the sublime nature of God, to the wonder of God, that I think leads God to later speak rightly of Job, to uplift Job's practice, even if he failed in some of the content. May we, like Job, be in this relentless pursuit. It's a pursuit of God. Because once we encounter God in our daily lives and moments in the face of others, may we then be open to the wonder, to the awestruck nature of God and God's movements. That is my prayer for you this morning, and that is my prayer for our journeys of faith together. Amen.